debate. The Honourable Member for Outremont. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I would like to point out that I intend to share my time with the Honourable Member for Parkdale High Park. Thank you. Now, Mr. Speaker, since this is my first formal speech in this House since the by-election of September 17th, allow me to thank the voters of the riding of Outremont for having placed their trust in me. I intend to honor that trust by working with the same determination and dedication I've always shown in my other duties when I was an MNA and in other positions I've held throughout my career. The by-election perhaps was the scene of a change which will turn out to be important on the Quebec and Canadian political scenes. And I think that the throne speech delivered this week gives us a few indications of that change. Indeed, if you look at two subjects in particular, which are mentioned in the speech from the throne, I can tell you that it was Afghanistan and the environment, especially Kyoto, that led to the most questions from voters during my campaign. When in April I decided to add my experience and my voice to the NDP upon request of our leader, I realized that the priorities that always motivated my work in politics were in fact the priorities of the NDP. Real and credible support for sustainable development, a strong voice for peace and the role Canada has always played in the world, and an honest desire to make sure that the prosperity we have in our society is distributed equitably. That is the kind of message that we brought forth in the field during a campaign that lasted several months in our case, because even though I joined the NDP in April, the by-election was only called July 28. But we were already out there in the streets for many months. We knew the challenge this represented. More than one commentator stated that this was an impregnable liberal fortress in Outremont. Well, there you have it. We've taken the impenetrable fortress, and I'm very pleased to be one of the first MPs from the NDP to represent a Quebec riding. When I was canvassing door to door, the two most important issues brought forward were A, the environment, and B, Afghanistan. Let's talk about both. In the context of a week where we're debating the throne speech, let's look at what this important change is that we're experiencing in Canada and Quebec. I would even go so far as to say that for about 40 years now, the demarcation in Quebec politics and by that very fact, influencing all of Canadian politics, consisted in looking first and foremost at our position about a constitutional issue and not an economic or social issue. That line, which meant that at the National Assembly in Quebec City, the forces represented both right and left, because what united them was their vision, on the one hand, for an independent Quebec, or on the other hand, the vision that Quebec was better within Canada and Canada was better with Quebec. And it wasn't incompatible to be both Quebecer and Canadian. Others see it differently and are legitimately seeking to make Quebec an independent country. That was never a vision I shared, and I've always been very clear on that. However, with regard to Quebec's autonomy, since I spent my entire career in Quebec, I can tell you that that is a vision that is shared by people who know that when you talk about the Quebec nation, those are not hollow words. They have to have real meaning. Now, with regard to the environment, let's look at what distinguishes us from the current Conservative government and what distinguishes us from the previous Liberal government. It's been an interesting week to have this analysis because this week the former Prime Minister, Mr. Chrétien, published his memoirs. It's interesting to note that in his memoirs he lays blame, and this is his choice, on his predecessor, or his successor rather, as Prime Minister, who's still a member in this House. He says that it's because of his successor that Canada has not met Kyoto objectives. What's interesting to note is that it's the current leader of the Liberal Party who was the Minister of the Environment at the time, throughout the whole time that this other member was Prime Minister. A former Liberal Prime Minister who was in power over 10 years is saying that if we never met the Kyoto objectives, it's because of the current leader of the Liberal Party. What is rigorously true is that for 13 years, rather than seeing a reduction in greenhouse gases in Canada, the Liberals presided over an unprecedented rise in levels. No other signatory to the Kyoto Protocol saw such an increase in greenhouse gas emissions.
The current Conservative government is trying to use that incompetence as a pretext for continuing to do nothing, because that's precisely what they're proposing in the throne speech. As I went door to door in Outremont, people asked me to go beyond these two parties that have been divided for so long. They've asked us to go beyond the confines of constitutional issues, and to think about the future. They've asked us to bring the NDP's vision here of social justice and concern for youth. That's why I'm so proud, Mr. Speaker, to be an NDP member from Outremont. The other file, Mr. Speaker, that was most often raised after the environment was the war or current combat in southern Afghanistan. Well, clearly stating that Canadian soldiers there all deserve our greatest respect for their devotion, their dedication. It is our role to say that we absolutely do not share the government's view of this military intervention, like the U.S., which, in our opinion, like many experts, is doomed to fail. There's less security today in Afghanistan, not more. So even if people are convinced that this is a noble mission, you have to look at the facts. You have to look at how many Canadian soldiers are coming back in a casket. The idea is supposed to be a peace process. That's precisely the message of the New Democratic Party, and that's why I'm so proud to work both for future generations and the environment, and for peace and a fairer social justice vision all across Canada, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Peterborough.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the new member for Outremont to this House. I know that he worked very hard to win that riding, as many of us do during elections, to win our respective ridings, and I congratulate him for that. However, there's kind of an incomplete vision, I believe, on the part of the NDP with respect to Afghanistan. They say that they do not support the current mission. They really haven't provided any vision for what type of a mission that they would support. Although, Mr. Speaker, they do often say that they would like to provide aid, but they don't say aid to whom. And this is the big question, Mr. Speaker. Without security, there can be no aid, there can be no development. We cannot help the women and children, 6 million children that are going to school. And I ask the honourable member to please think about the long-term effects of these 6 million children that are currently in school, and what a profound difference that will make in Afghanistan over the next 20 years. I ask him, can he share some of that vision, and does he understand that these 6 million children currently in school will make a significant difference on the future of Afghanistan? I'd like to hear the answer, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Outremont. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Peterborough for his question, and I'd like to reassure him that I think we've done enough work in this file to have a valid opinion. And yes, indeed, our opinion is that there's less security in this poor country, and I use that term advisedly. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, which has experienced virtually relentless war since the Soviet Union invaded in the 70s. And we need to bring all of Canada's peacekeeping knowledge and experience to bear in Afghanistan instead of, since Operation Enduring Freedom and the creation of the ISAF International Force and the exclusion in the bond process of certain parties, we're stuck in a combat quagmire that's been dictated by the United States, and in our view, that was a serious mistake. We should use our experience and credibility as peacekeepers and peacemakers, and then the young people and women you're talking about will indeed be better off in the future. The Honourable Member for West Nova. I'd like to join others in welcoming the member to the House of Commons and congratulate him on his election and wish him every success in his parliamentary career. My question for him is whether his opinions on limiting or perhaps eliminating the federal spending power in areas of provincial jurisdiction. Like me, I'm sure he favors sound social programs and the federal government's intervention in partnership with provincial governments to improve the quality of lives of all Canadians, especially those with fewer resources than others, who perhaps need this kind of social program less. And we're talking here about health, EI, daycare, early childhood education. This requires federal intervention into provincial areas of jurisdiction. My question for him is, what's his opinion on what bill the Conservative government might put forward? The Honourable Member for Outremont. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for West Nova for his question, but at the same time, I'd like to recommend that he read his own leader's intervention yesterday. He may just find that what he's saying doesn't really jive with what his leader said on this very important issue to Canada. So he wants to know what the NDP's position is on this. All he has to do is look at any of our daycare bills. There's a very clear provision that excludes Quebec from the application of that legislation because Quebec already has a position. That's what the NDP leader clearly said yesterday. But I can also say to him that on the face of it, what's proposed here, it makes us not at all uncomfortable. If you look at the NDP's history over the past 30 years, we have always had a clear understanding that Quebec was a nation, not just a nation with a vague term, it's a meaningful term, and that is an indication from us that that position, which would limit federal intervention in areas of exclusive provincial jurisdiction,